Initiation by Elisabeth Haich, Chapter 19, Visions. There came a period in my life in which I often had visions while perfectly wide awake. Many of them had such a tremendous effect on me and on my later life that I must mention the most important of them. Towards the end of every summer, my husband and I made a journey through various countries. Once, as we were on our way back from Italy, we stopped over in the Dolomites for some mountain climbing. Here I experienced one of the most profound, impressive visions of my life. One evening, after an exhausting day in the mountains, we returned to our hotel to lie down. The sun had shone with such intense fierceness during our hiking that it seemed as if every single ray were a spear aimed straight at my back and my heart. The gigantic reddish rock walls reflected the sunshine in every direction, seeming to magnify it 1,000-fold. The whole atmosphere was demonic. Everything was glowing with heat as if we were walking in the antechamber of hell. I was really happy when we finally turned home, and the sun, which had been burning like a flamethrower, disappeared behind the horizon at last. I went to bed and I stretched out, ready to fall asleep. In this self-same instant, I suddenly felt as if the ceiling were falling in on me, as if I were falling into a bottomless abyss, falling towards instant death. A doctor, summoned at the desperate plea of my husband, found I was suffering from a heart attack. He gave me an injection. The night dragged on, and when morning came, my pulse beat was still so weak that it was scarcely discernible. Tortured with the feeling of annihilation, I learned to know what it means to be afraid of death. As was my custom, I observed myself closely even under these circumstances, discovering that fear of death is a physical condition. In my consciousness, there was peace and calm, no fear of death at all. Yet I was suffering from such terrible fear of death that I can scarcely find words to express it. It was unbearable. I was no longer completely in the world, and yet not in the next. I was hovering in nothingness, suffering so horribly, I thought I would rather die than go on bearing this torture. I gave up the struggle, deciding to go into death, knowingly, in order to escape from this fear of it. However, just as I wanted to glide over with my consciousness into this nothingness of which I had been so afraid, the space around me suddenly expanded in all directions, and infinity spread out before my astonished eyes. In this infinity, I saw a long, long road winding onward, and at its end, beyond everything material, standing in reality, the majestic form of a man, made of blinding light, his arms stretched out in indescribable love. He seemed infinitely far away from me, and his countenance shone with such an intensely powerful light that it blinded me, and I could not see his features. Nevertheless, I recognized him as the Savior of the world. On the road, oval beings that looked like eggs were moving forward slowly. As they moved along together, they gave the impression of so many sheep, viewed from such an angle that only their backs were visible, but not their feet. I stood at the beginning of this road and had to show them the way. They jogged past me slowly, in steady stream, moving in the direction of the figure of light, who awaited them with outstretched arms. Those who reached for him entered into his light and disappeared, merging with his resplendent glory. The whole long road was covered with a seemingly endless stream of these oval beings which I recognized as human souls. I showed them the way and kept on pointing out the direction to take as more and more, ever more of these souls approached. I began to realize that I was not yet going to die because I still had this work to do, and that I could not die at all until I had fulfilled my task. I realized too that I would be doing this work for a very long time, until my sand in the great cosmic hourglass would run out, and I myself would return to my homeland of light, where ever radiant love would be awaiting me. Infinite peace came over me, and my heart began to function more normally. Even though still weak, I glanced at my husband, who was observing me with a worried face. I could move my tongue again a little, and I whispered to him that I was better. The poor dear boy cried like a child, out of pure joy that I could speak again and that the light was coming back into my eyes. After another day in bed, I had recovered sufficiently to be able to travel again. A few days more and all was back to normal. During our summertime sojourns at the lake shore, I was almost always more receptive to visions and in a state of greater sensitivity for sending and receiving telepathic messages. Once, during our summer vacation, we went to bed after a happy day. The house became quiet, and I fell asleep beside my husband. I dreamed all kinds of chaotic, apparently unrelated pictures, and then in my dreams I suddenly heard steps, slow, dragging steps. They caused me to realize that I had dozed off where I was sitting at the top of a long flight of stairs. For a long time there had been no one passing from whom I could beg anything. Now the sound of someone approaching woke me. In a few moments I was quite awake and my eyes were open, and then I saw the slow dragging steps were those of a very old broken man who had plodded along painfully to the position I occupied and was now preparing to sit down at the other side of this flight of stairs. These stairs led from where we were, in an elevated corner of the city, down into the center of the town below. In the section around us, there were many state and municipal offices, so thousands of people had to go up and down these steps every day. Only now, at midday, is there a short intermission in the otherwise steady stream of people. It's a good place for me to sit. The roof at the entrance of the staircase protected me from the rain, and my revenue is good. I have my regular customers who give me alms every day on the way to their offices. But what an impertinence it is for this old beggar to post himself here too. He's bound to do me harm. People going by are not going to give to two beggars at once, and so I'm certain to lose half my income. I looked at him impatiently, and I wanted to tell him to go somewhere else to do his begging. This is my place, and it's up to him to clear out. I look at him, and an uncertain feeling grips me. I peer into his eyes and suddenly feel uneasy. I see, too, that he is embarrassed. He makes a movement as if to run away, but it's too late. I recognize him, and he recognizes me. Oh, Father of mercy, it is he. Here is the man I've been seeking all my life, the man who abandoned me, the man I could never forget, and now he's sitting opposite me, a beggar, just like myself. Oh, why do we have to meet again like this? I look at him, his wrinkled old face and his skin. His lips hang loose and limp. His thin, matted hair and his beard are neglected. His clothes consist of old, worn-out rags. What has become of the handsome, elegant young cavalier he once was? He looks at me in pain and anguish, conscious of his debt, ashamed. His old, wrinkled face contorts. His weak, flabby lips droop downward, and he begins to cry in silence. He reaches upward to wipe away his tears, and so I see his hands covered with brittle skin, cracked, full of wounds, his long, dirty fingernails, his stiff, neglected, revolting, gouty fingers. Oh, these hands, they were once so beautiful, so elegant, so well cared for. These hands I was once so happy to kiss. Then I look at my hands. Oh, horrors, they are just as old as neglected as his. And when I raise them up, I see my own fingers bent and knotted with gout. The skin of my hands cracked and bloody in thousands of places. Since when have my hands become so horrible, so revolting? I do not know. I have never thought of observing myself. I've been living like a sleepwalker. Now, as if coming out of a stupor, I begin to remember. It's as if a heavy, impenetrable fog, recovering my consciousness, were now beginning to roll back and give me a clear view. I survey my whole life, my situation among people who treated me as if I were half animal, without love, without pity. In my semi-conscious state, I put up with everything. Their many blows, their heartlessness, their ridicule as they, the people on the farm, made fun of my imperfections and my helplessness. How could I have thought about the way my hands looked, or about my appearance in general? When I was young, I sometimes wanted to be pretty, to please him. In those days, I tied colored ribbons in my hair. But after I lost him and the baby, I didn't care about anything anymore. I never thought again about looking in a mirror, and I didn't care how my hands looked. I only cared what people put in my outstretched, begging hands. Yes, now I can remember clearly that many people, as they were reaching over to put a coin in my hand, and I was grasping it eagerly, quickly drew back their hand from mine and let the money fall in order not to touch my fingers. Now I understand. Now I am disgusted too when I look at my decrepit hands, when I look at my dirty, torn, stinking beggar's rags. I wonder what my face looks like. Oh, if only he had not abandoned me so cruelly. Neither of us would now be in this horrible state of neglect, and I would not have lost the child. Why? Why did this all have to happen? And why must we meet again in this way? Our lives are over. There is no way we can make amends. It's all over. Too late. Too late. Unspeakable hopelessness comes over me, and I plunge into absolute despair. A terrible pain cuts through my whole being. I feel my heart is breaking. A cramp holds my heart, as in a vice, and then everything blacks out before me. Everything disappears. I fall into the abyss of nothingness. Someone is groaning, rasping, gasping. I hear it, and I want to see who it is. Slowly, it gets light around me, and then my glance comes to rest on my husband's terrified face. Suddenly, I realize that I am the one who is struggling to breathe. I am sitting up in bed, and he is shaking me desperately. When he sees that I recognize him, he breathes a sigh of relief, and he asks in a half-terrified voice, "What's the matter with you? Are you all right again? I was frightened stiff. I woke up because of your groaning. You were sitting up in bed with your eyes wide open, but you didn't recognize me. You were looking right through me. right off into the distance. Didn't even see me. What's the matter with you? For heaven's sakes, tell me what's the matter. I look at him, open my mouth to reply, but cannot bring forth a single sound. My throat is still clamped shut from the sheer horror. Little by little, I recover my senses enough to form words he can hear and understand. Not now. I cannot speak now. Tomorrow. My husband stops asking questions, and I fall back on my pillows. He holds my hand in his as he observes me carefully. Then, seeing that I've calmed down again, he puts out the light. The next morning, we sat together in the garden, and I told him my vision of the previous night. I was a beggar woman who remembered her whole life, and I am or was once this beggar woman. I remember everything clearly that I once experienced when I was this woman. It was my own life which suddenly awakened to consciousness. I was an abandoned servant girl, I went on telling my husband, living on a large country estate. I had no father, had no memory of ever having had either a father or a mother. Among the many people around me as I grew up, there was a coachman who took care of the horses, men, servants who cut the wood and fed the hunting dogs, the cook who worked in the big kitchen, and many other girls working in the kitchen, the courtyard, and the house. This is where I have grown up, and this is all I know as home. Ever since I can remember, people have been pushing me around, and I have had to work at whatever jobs they gave me to do. After I grew up, I also had to help in the big house where our master and his family lived. It was a huge house with many rooms, and I learned from the chambermaids that the rooms and their furnishings were all very beautiful. I was never allowed to enter them because I had no shoes. Only servants with shoes were allowed inside. I was an outside maid. All the rooms opened onto a very, very long corridor, and it was my job to keep this corridor clean. I carried over huge buckets of water from the well. Then, kneeling down, I scrubbed the big colored tiles with a brush. I see these tiles quite close to my face as I bend over them and rub, rub, rub. Move back a row and then rub some more. Now and again I pour out water onto the floor, and I go on rubbing row by row, endlessly, and when I finally do finish, I have to wash the corridor on the floor above. Days go by, months and years, and I go on washing and scrubbing these same stone floors. I am contented and seldom think about anything beyond the work that I have to do. I like to wash these tile floors. They are colorful, and I like colorful things. In return for my work, I can eat in the kitchen, and I can sleep in the little room over the stable behind the house. In the courtyard, I often see carriages, which do not belong to our master. They belong to his guests, who have already alighted at the front door. The coachmen drive their carriages into the courtyard, unhitch the horses, walk them around in a circle until they're cooled off, and then lead them into the stable for the night. Many guests come for hunting, and then my corridors are full of mud. The many men walk around with muddy boots, and I have to get up at the crack of dawn to wash my corridors so that they will be clean when my master and his guests get up. One day, when I happen to be in the courtyard, a wonderfully handsome young man comes out of the house, crosses the courtyard, and enters the stable to look after the horse. He has his horse saddled, mounts, and rides away. As if struck by magic, I look up at him. He's so marvelously handsome. And once he even looks around at me. I idolize him as if he were a god. And later, during that very same night, when he visits me in my little room, I allow him with joyous abandon to do with me whatever he wishes. His face shines through the mists which obscure my mind. For long and rapturous minutes I am in his arms. He often came for hunting. My life was made of happy days when he was there, and long days of waiting for him to return. In a year's time, our baby came. In a year's time, our baby came. The cook helped me when I sought assistance and collapsed in front of her door. I did not know what was happening, but after I endured terrible suffering and they laid the baby in my arms, I felt warmth in my heart for it. For the first time in my life, I was really happy. Somebody needed me. For somebody, I meant everything. The cook spoke with the mistress who came and looked at me and the child and gave her consent for the child to remain with me. I will work, I promised, harder than ever before, if only I can keep my child. When he, the father of my child, came back to our house again for a visit and came up to my little room to see me again as was his custom, I proudly showed him the child and asked him to allow me to work in his house on his estate so that I could serve him. At first, he shrank back horrified and then went on his way to say that he was not at all sure he was the father. Who knows, he said, what servant around here may be the father? In vain, I tried to explain to him that no man had ever touched me, that I had defended myself like a wild animal, and that I had allowed only him to do as he wished with me. In vain, I pleaded with him to allow me to work in his vicinity, promising not to molest or disturb him, if only I could be near him. For a while he listened. Then, as I knelt before him, my arms around his knees, he pushed me away and ran out into the night. I never saw him again. Whether or not he ever came back to the house, I do not know. In any case, he never entered our courtyard again. In vain I waited, year after year. He disappeared out of my life. But the baby was there, and it meant everything to me. It filled my every waking thought. It meant more to me than life itself. I scrubbed the colored tiles in the corridor, and I thought of my baby. Excuse me. I drew water from the well, and I thought of my baby. I hurried through my work even harder and faster so that I could be with my child. It was a girl, pretty and intelligent like her father. She always did the opposite of what I told her, brooking no opposition. The more I became her slave, the less loving she was to me. When she was still quite small, she was rude and disrespectful towards me. Nothing I said or did pleased her, and what she liked best was to leave me and run around the courtyard alone. Sometimes she went so far that she came back only the next day. I was in desperation, and when work was over, went out at night to try to find her. When she came back the next day, the light came back into my life and everything was all right again. One day my child left me and did not come back. I waited in desperation, searched through the surrounding region, waited and hunted, but to no avail. My daughter was gone. The sun went out of my life. My world was suddenly empty. I had nothing more to live for, and I was absolutely unable to work. After a time, I could bear it no longer, and I went away to search for my child. I never returned. I traveled from town to town, village to village, asking people whether they had seen my child. Years went by, and I was still searching without hope, going on and on, out of pure habit, driven by inner unrest. People gave me food to eat, and as my clothes began to wear thin and get torn, they would give me old, worn-out odds and ends of clothing. I kept on going from place to place, on and on. Once in my wanderings I met the cook that I had worked with on the country estate. In the meantime, she had married, was living with her husband in the city where I first met her. She took me home, gave me some supper, and told me that the father of my child, here my husband, suddenly seized my hand and interrupted my story. White as a sheet, with trembling voice, he said, Wait, I'll go on with the story. I know what happened. I remember what happened then. While you were talking, everything suddenly became clear to me. I recognized myself, and I know I was this man who abandoned you. I was terribly frivolous then and lacking the responsibility. I lived only to amuse myself, and I threw my money around with both hands until the day came when I lost everything. My family property was auctioned off, and I was obliged to leave my land and my master. At first I turned to friends who had spent time drinking and gambling with me, and otherwise helping me squander my inheritance. But after a few weeks, they made it obvious that my presence in their homes was superfluous. This experience was repeated with other so-called friends until I was completely disgusted at myself and at them. About that time, a real friend advised me to go to work. I wanted to make a fresh start, and I sincerely tried to get work, but nobody took me in my search for work seriously. I did not know how to work or what I should do, so I sank lower and lower. Finally, I got a fixed idea that my tragic lot was God's punishment for having so despicably abandoned you and my child. I went to see my friend, I went to see my friend in whose home you had worked. I had no mission other than to find out what had happened to you both. But when I came, you were gone, and no one knew where. As time went on, I found fewer and fewer friends willing to lend me money. When the time came that none of my erstwhile friends would take me in and give me a loan as I was getting on in years, I began to ask complete strangers for help. So little by little I became a beggar roaming the country, traveling from place to place, spending the night wherever good-hearted people would allow me to sleep in their barn or stable. Physically as well as financially, I fell further and further into ruin. With hunger plaguing me more and more as I got on in years, I finally reached the point where I had no pride or self-respect at all anymore, and began to beg publicly on busy street corners. Thus it came about that we finally met as beggars. I listened eagerly to everything he told me, for it was exactly as I knew it to be. I knew from the very moment that my husband was a beggar. I knew from the very moment that my husband was a beggar, and I was amazed that he too remembered this previous existence in as much detail as I. The events he recalled tallied exactly with what the cook told me, and when I visited her, namely, that he had squandered his inheritance and estate, and that one time, much later, he had come by the manor where I'd worked in the hope of finding me. There was nothing left of the dashing young cavalier he had once been. Through sheer neglect and lack of honest effort, he had already become a human derelict, roaming the countryside, looking for handouts. After I met the cook and went back to our old manor to ask whether anyone knew his address, but there was no one who knew where he had gone or where he could be found. As I got on in years, I found it harder and harder to travel. Finally, I settled in the city, and I made my living by begging near the stairs. It was there we finally met again, and there I passed my last hours. For when I recognized him, and I realized that my whole life had been wasted, and that there was no way of making amends because it was too late. Too late. Our child was lost, and my life was over. I died right there, sitting on the cornerstone. My memories stopped there. For a long time we looked at each other, speechless, scarcely believing that such a thing could happen. to two intelligent people in this modern world. What we had just experienced cannot be explained by any of the current theories of heredity and psychology. We knew that everything had really and truly happened just that way. There was no imagination involved. The experience of having remembered this earlier meeting shook us both to the depths of our being. For a while we sat beside each other in complete silence while our thoughts spun round in circles, and finally my husband said, "I never before wondered why, since my early youth, I have strictly avoided drinking, cards, and other games of chance, dancing, and all other forms of social life. This despite the fact that it is very much in my nature to enjoy drinking, dancing, and entertainment. Now I realize, after squandering my inheritance in riotous living and being obliged to live in abject misery, the idea was hammering home deeper and deeper into my consciousness that I must never again drink, never again gamble, never again be careless and happy-go-lucky. Since then, I have learnt to recognize the value of money, and I have come to realize that the worth of human beings begins when he is able to make a living for himself and his family. All these views now lie anchored deep in my subconscious because of what I learned and what I came to realize in that incarnation. That's why in my present life I was so anxious to study, just study throughout all the years of my youth. The subconscious knowledge and the recognition of these facts was what gave me strength to resist and say no when the boys I went to college with set out to amuse themselves. I was always afraid that something terrible would happen to me if I allowed myself to get caught up in their parties and social life. And now I realize that I was only afraid of the misery which resulted from my devil-may-care way of living in that previous existence. My profound antipathy towards drinking and gambling and my realization that I must never indulge in such a way of life were rooted deep in my subconscious. Yes, I replied, and after having been completely idle in that life, you are now diligent to a fault, thinking only of your work. That's right, in the second half of that existence of mine, I wanted to work, but I hadn't learned a trade. I didn't even know what work meant. When I asked for work, people refused to take me seriously, wouldn't even trust me to do a job. Later, during my vagabond years, a stranger took pity on me, gave me work, cutting wood, loading carts, gathering grapes, beating carpets, and while I did these menial tasks with unskilled hands unused to work, I began to feel the great and overpowering desire to learn something useful, to be rich in skill and knowledge. And so in my life I have learned everything I possibly could, and I intend to continue learning till the end of my days. When he spoke the words, "till the end of my days," I felt as if an iron hand were contracting about my heart. Where will my child and I be at the end of his days? I became stiff with fear. It is the law of nature. When we strike our hand against a wall, the wall strikes back without intending to. It isn't the wall which really strikes back, but our own blow bounces back. In any case, whatever we hit always comes back to us, gives back to us the same blow we gave it. No, I don't want to think about this premonition clear to the end. We will not leave him. No, no, no. Then I thought about the relationship between my past life and my present one. What was the reason for this weakness of mine, for having lived in this mental fog, and why, without any transition, I was now blessed with talents and skills? I could find no explanation. For days we were under the impression that this tremendous experience of this tremendous experience, but soon we found ourselves swimming and boating with our neighbor friends. So our memories from a previous existence soon began to pale. We were both of us much too businesslike to bother our heads excuse me, to bother our heads about the long distance past. My husband was soon obliged to leave anyway, as his holidays were over. I stayed on with other members of my family and their children. The entire region of the Great Lake was of volcanic origin, and the local radiations probably affected me so greatly that I often had visions there. I am inclined by nature to be very matter-of-fact, and always try to find a natural reason for everything that I experience. I was never inclined to believe in ghosts or demons, and when people told me stories about nocturnal manifestations or appearances that were supposed to be almost nightly events in one old castle or another, I just smiled condescendingly in the manner of the inexperienced, thinking to myself that these persons were letting their imaginations run away with them. The very last thing I would have imagined is that I myself would have such an experience. Moreover, it is characteristic of visions that one never succeeds in having them through an act of will. On the other hand, they can come quite suddenly and unexpectedly when one's mind is fully occupied with other things. That same summer, after my husband had returned to his work in the city, we were all retiring to rest after a happy day, and I entered my room where my little son was already fast asleep. I lay down, extinguished the candle. In this remote place there was no electricity, and went to sleep. I do not know how long I'd been sleeping when suddenly I awoke, aware of a noise in the room. It sounded as if someone were groping around in the darkness. I reached for the box of matches, quickly lit my candle, and a moment later was lunging toward a horrible apparition, which was already carrying my child in its arms, trying to escape. It was a female form, similar to pictures that one sees of witches, and when I surprised her with my light, she was trying to glide out of the room on a cord or wire which led from our beds through the window. I lunged at her. I seized my child. I tried to take it away from her. She hung on tight, and a terrible struggle began, and the witch had already moved up a bit on the wire. It seemed almost as if, in some way or another, she were connected to it, as if there were a flow of force from it to give her strength. But she could not get away, because I clung desperately to my child. Each of us was holding my boy's body in a grip of steel, pulling him to and fro as we struggled. Somehow, I felt intuitively that she could only hold on to my child for a short time, and if she could not succeed in wrenching him from me within this short time, she would have to fly away empty-handed. So this violent struggle continued until she suddenly and quite unexpectedly relinquished the child and glided out of the window on the wire and disappeared into the darkness. And I was kneeling in my bed, and my son was lying beside me, resting in absolute peace, snugly covered and sound asleep, but the candle was burning on my night table. Had I been dreaming? Had I forgotten to extinguish the candle before falling asleep? No, the match was still glowing beside it, proving that I had only just lit the candle. The entire scene must have taken place within the space of a few moments. If it were not so, the match would not still be warm. No, I had not been dreaming. I extinguished the candle, lay back in bed, and tried to quiet my galloping heartbeat. What was that? A witch? Are there such things? What is a witch? Why do painters everywhere always paint the same kind of witches? And where does this figure come from? How does it come about that there are such things as witches in the first place? And why do people claim that witches ride on broomsticks? If witches are really only a figment of the imagination, why do drawings and sketches of them look just about the same the world over, showing them with long, pointed, droopy noses, hunched backs, and broomsticks in their hands? Why isn't a witch ever shown with a club foot? Because people say that the devil has a club foot. But how do they know for sure that the devil has a club foot and the witch does not? Who has ever seen a devil and a witch? Now I have some idea about why witches are drawn with broomsticks in their hand. The witch I had seen was holding onto this wire, and when she flew out the window on it, I could easily have imagined her to be riding on a broomstick. I can understand that uneducated villagers who know nothing about currents of force think a witch is holding onto a broomstick and flying away on it. The witch was the personified servant of the evil one. I simply knew it. She was reality, a fact. She was reality, a fact. Had the whole scene been merely a projection, an illusion? Naturally, I knew it had been, but what caused it? Where did it come from? And why just such a picture? For me, that was reality. And the interesting question was, why everyone who sees such an illusion of projection, or whatever we may call it, sees it in the same form? Why do we all carry this picture in our subconscious, if it really does come from the subconscious? It could, of course, be answered that I had seen such pictures of witches, and this was a projection of pictures I'd seen. But such was not the case, for even though the witch was very similar to the usual pictures one sees, I noticed to my great surprise that her appearance did not coincide with them in all details. And where did this strange wire or rope come from? I had never seen such a thing in any of the pictures, and yet it was there. Moreover, after my experiments with the transmission of will from one person to another, I had quite a different opinion of this wire. I could understand it in terms of a flow of force, perhaps even a flow of will. But where did it come from? And from whom? And if a flow of force can be seen as a physical form, it is not the witch herself, perhaps merely a form built up of forces, radiating from a source of different sources. And what are we human beings? Where does the human form come from? Are we not also visible forms made up of various flows of forces? What is reality? Only what can be touched and grasped? Are we not human beings? Are we not too merely projections? And do we not merely believe that we are actually formed? Are not love, hate, hope, desperation, good and evil realities too? Do not people suffer or rejoice because of these intangible and visible forces, which are not less actual than the intangible realities? Naturally, I know the physical form of my child, the real child, as people would say, was lying peacefully in bed during my struggle with the apparition. And I am equally convinced that the entire struggle occurred only between forces and not between bodies. But does that mean that this struggle is any less real? Was not perhaps the apparition of the witch and the child even much more real than the child's material form lying in bed? What is a material form? Only the resultant outward cover of forces which build up the material body, hence the force is the cause, the material body only the effect. Which is more important and more real? For a long time, I went on asking myself these and similar questions about the experiences I had had. For me, it was perfectly real. I had enough proof that I had not fallen asleep, and even had this been the case, it is perfectly possible to experience complete reality in a dream. Several nights later, after my family had gone to bed and the house quieted down, I too went to bed. It had been an exceptionally hot day, and my room was close and sultry, and so I not only left my window open, but also the door from my room into the hall outside. Thus, from my bed, I could see the staircase leading up to the rooms above. As I lay here, I reviewed the whole day in my mind. What had I done well? What not so well? What should I have said or done? And what should I have not said or done? When I went over in my mind what I wanted to cook the next day, then I went over in my mind what I wanted to cook the next day, for the housekeeping was my task. Thus my thoughts were occupied with quite everyday matter-of-fact things. Suddenly I noticed that two peculiar forms were approaching from the door, trying slowly and stealthily to cross in front of mine. They were both full-sized human forms, absolutely black like shadows. I didn't see them as three-dimensional figures. Instead, I had the impression that the only reason I could see them at all was because they were absorbing all the light in the place that happened to be. To express the matter in different terms, I did not really see these beings themselves, but the hole they made in the rays of light where they were. In scientific terms, they were causing complete interference with the light rays, and I could only be aware of their presence by virtue of the fact that there were no light rays at all where these two beings stood. Otherwise, they were invisible. It's difficult to find an expression adequate to describe this phenomena. In a twinkling, I understood why farmers use the word shadow in talking about ghosts and spooky apparitions. Actually, these two figures were shadows, but not shadows made by anything else. On the contrary, they were shadows solely because of the complete absence of light. I had never dreamed that there could be such complete blackness. Later it occurred to me that the astronomers know of such a black hole in the skies, caused by a complete absence of light. It's known as the horse's head because of its peculiar shape. They cannot explain it in other terms than as an interference in light rays. Something swallows up and destroys the light radiating from the universe, and we see only the huge shadow. The two figures I saw were made of the same absence of light. On their shoulders they carried a pole, from which something utterly and indescribably horrible was hanging. It resembled an octopus, except that it had no organic or organized form. It hung down from this pole like an amorphous mass of raw dough, constantly expanding and then contracting. It was a loathsome, greenish, pussy, decaying mass in which, somehow or other, I knew sickness, misfortune, catastrophes, and death were lurking. I knew that this monster was concentrated evil itself. It turned and stretched on the pole with intentional wickedness, and I realized it was looking for new opportunities and victims on which to wreak its fearful power. I saw the shadowy figures moving towards my sister's room. Horrified, I knew I must prevent this satanic source of power from causing any harm. Sitting bolt upright in bed, I screamed at the top of my lungs, "Greet! Greet!" Even as I screamed, the two shadowy figures disappeared simultaneously, while the demon shrank in size and rolled up into a greenish phosphorescent sphere, about the size of a football, and then rolled with gliding, jumping movements up the steps. In a voice filled with hellish laughter, of which I was perfectly aware, although I could not hear it with my physical ears, it screamed scornfully at me, "So you think you can catch me? Ha 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 ha!" With that, it slipped through the open window and disappeared into the darkness. I sprang out of my bed and I ran down the hallway to see what it was. Everywhere there was absolute silence. Almost at the same moment, my brother opened his door upstairs, came out to the banister and looked down and asked, "Who's down there?" I lighted a candle and I answered, "It is I." "Why? Why have you come out of your room?" "I woke up suddenly," he said, as if in a nightmare, with a feeling that some terrible danger was in the house. I came out of my room to have a look around. "And you're up. What's the matter?" While he was speaking, my 2 sisters came from their rooms, and then the servants, all wondering why I had screamed. I told them everything. Then we searched the house. We found the door locked and everything in its proper place. I asked my brother to try to move the window above the stairs to see whether perhaps a draft or air could have moved it in such a way to cause it to reflect the full moon. Perhaps this was the reason for my having seen the greenish phosphorescent ball. But the moon was on the other side of the house. It was quite impossible for me to have seen a reflection of it from my bed. Having found nothing, we all made the choice to go back to bed. For a long time I kept hearing the fiendish taunt. "So you think you can catch me?" A few days later, my little son complained about a tummy ache. I felt sure that the pains were caused by appendicitis. I left with him the very same day to go back to the city and have him examined by one of my father's friends, who had become a famous surgeon and director at a large hospital. He found there was actually an irritation in the appendix, but he said we could wait until autumn to operate, so we drove back to the lake shore, where my little son was able to play with his young friends until we left the resort at the end of summer. In looking back, I would like best to be able to skip the period which followed, in order not to have to re-experience all the events of the time in my memory. Nevertheless, I find myself obliged to recount the broad lines that make the later events of my life understandable. The child was operated on, and the operation was successful. A week later, he was allowed to come back home. During the time that he was in the hospital, my sister's little daughter took sick with a very strange and persistent throat infection. Once, during a visit, I saw that she had a red skin rash under the compress around her neck. On the assumption that the rash might have been caused by the wet compress, her skin was then treated with a powder. By the next day, the rash had disappeared. By the time my son was discharged from the hospital, his little cousin was up, and the 2 were soon playing all day long. But there was something about my son's appearance that I did not like. He was pale, tired, lacking in energy. Worst of all, instead of gathering strength, he became weaker and more depressed with each passing day. A week later, when I took his temperature, I was shocked to find he was running a high fever. He began to cry bitterly, and he seemed to be getting worse moment by moment. Singularly enough, his body was covered with a rash, which looked exactly like the one his little cousin had had on her neck. We called the most famous child specialist in the area, and after an examination, he asked whether anyone in the family had had scarlet fever. "No," I replied, "no one." "Are you sure no one had a persistent throat infection?" The ground began to teeter under my feet. "Yes," I said. "His little cousin had a sore throat for a long time, and a similar skin rash on her neck." The professor smiled. "Yes, that was scarlet fever. Your son's resistance was still low, and he caught a severe infection. We'll have to vaccinate him immediately. Are you going to take care of the child?" he asked me. "Yes." "Have you had scarlet fever?" "No, and I won't get it either. I'm immune to all infectious diseases." "I can only assume the responsibility," said the professor, "if we vaccinate you too." I knew from experience that I could not endure serum of any kind, and I tried to convince him that we should not vaccinate me. All in vain. We were both vaccinated with a serum that was quite new at the time and scarcely tested. I felt like an ox being brought to the slaughterhouse. I was obliged knowingly to permit myself to be poisoned. You can take my word. I will not harm you. These words were ringing in my ears for a long time. Later, as I lay helplessly sick and poisoned, a hair's breadth away from death, I wished many times I could call in this well-intentioned doctor so he could see why a physician should sometimes listen to his patient and not merely treat him like a number. The serum was a slow, insidious poison. First, we had to fight desperately for the boy's life. 6 long weeks I sat at his bedside while his fever raged. At 104 and 105, the effect of the long protracted fever and the reaction of the serum were so strong that his heartbeat often failed him. A young doctor moved in with us to be ready any minute, day or night, with an injection to start the heart beating again. There were 3 of us in an isolated apartment, fighting for the boy's life. So, you think you can catch me? Again and again, I heard that hellish laugh in my ears, while for long days and nights I held the child in my arms, refusing to give up. I got him back from the witch. His appendix was already out, but the battle with the greenish phosphorescent monster was not yet over. My son became weak and weaker. My son became weaker and weaker as his fever mounted. The professor vaccinated him with a new dose of serum. For a few days the fever abated, but then the left side of the boy's throat began to swell. The doctor said the infection had settled in a gland, and they watched the swelling to see whether they would have to operate. It grew bigger with each passing day, so the boy's head was leaning far off to one side. Our struggle grew more and more desperate as his fever kept on rising. The child was in constant delirium. For 5 long weeks we had scarcely been able to get more than an hour or 2 of sleep a day. The child rolled to and fro in the bed, quieting down a bit whenever I held him in my arms. The last 5 days I was sitting beside his bed, constantly holding his poor little body in my arms and waiting, listening to his heavy breathing, and waiting for 5 endlessly long days and nights I waited. I had never believed it possible for a human being to go on so long without sleep. After 5 days and 5 nights, I was still holding the child in my arms. During these long hours, I recalled often having heard mothers complain about their children's ingratitude. Is that why I took care of him? Is that why I made such sacrifices and sat at his bedside when he was sick, etc., etc.? In doing so, I realized that a mother does not take care of her child for its sake, but for her own sake. There are many mothers who imagine themselves to be good and devoted mothers because they take care of their children. No, by such criterion, I was not a good mother, for I was nursing my child, doing everything possible in my life, in my power, to save his life. For my sake, I shuddered at the thought of losing the child. No, it was not that I loved the child. It was for love of myself that I wanted to save it. It was so important to me. I was spiritually so closely tied to my child that I couldn't even bear the thought that it might disappear from my life. I sat there holding my boy in my arms, realizing full well that I was doing this for myself and that I wanted to keep the child for myself. I held him close in my arms and I tried to give him some of my own vital force so that he would remain with me. Yes, I knew that an invisible force radiates from the solar plexus of each human being, force that can grow to giant strength when the person really wants something with all his heart. It can even conquer the gravitational pull of the earth. Now I wanted to increase the power of gravitation. I wanted to keep my child here on earth. I sat there with my child, trying to concentrate all my thoughts on giving him strength to overcome the terrible sickness. Nevertheless, I could not pray, God, keep my child alive. Things are never bad. I remembered the words of Epictetus. It's only the way you think about them. From my standpoint, it Would have been the greatest catastrophe to lose the child, but I must not pray to the greatest power, the Creator, for personal, subjective things, for He knows what is good and why, and I must not want to keep my child for short-sighted human reasons, and the child, for him too it is certainly best, for God's will to be done, whatever that may be. So, as I sat there with my boy in my arms, my little human maternal self was trembling for fear of losing the child, but I was praying constantly, "Thy will be done, Thy will be done." I repeated it hundreds of times for those long hours while my body was getting stiffer and stiffer until finally began to rebel. My back was so numb I couldn't feel it anymore. I tried to change my position ever so slightly, but the child noticed every movement at once, tightened its grip on me, and cried out, stay here, hold me tight. If you stay here and hold me tight, I'll forgive you for all the wrong you've ever done to me." My mind was reeling. What wrong have I done that he could forgive me for? Up to that time, I thought I was doing everything a mother should do for her child. From the moment of its birth, this child took first place in all my thoughts. In every way I could, I wanted to make it happy. What secret wound was I now nursing? What wrong had I done that I needed its forgiveness? I tried to find out. "My little one," I said, "be quiet. I'm here with you now. I'm holding you tight. But what are you going to forgive me for?" He answered, "I don't know. Just hold me tight, and I'll forgive you for everything." I looked over at the young doctor, who said quietly, "He's talking in a delirium. Pay no attention to his words." Yes, he is delirious, but I already knew enough about psychology to know that my boy's words were coming forth from some great depth. I thought about them for a long time, wondering how I had wronged this human soul, what great debt I owed him. Until one day, everything became clear. On the evening of the 5th day, we'd gone without sleep. The child left me free again for a few minutes. With the young doctor's help, I got up, stiff in every joint, and went about like an automaton, doing the things that I needed to do. But my spirit was in such abysmal darkness, as if all the devils of hell were plunging after me. I was afraid I was going to crack up. I needed to find some new kind of strength to bear my burden. In such moments, a person gives up all his arrogance and he reaches out for help, wherever he hopes to find it. The Bible, the book, lay on the night table, and I reached for it. Like a drowning man, I opened it without thinking, and my eyes fell upon the following passage in the Old Testament. "Tear not. Your enemies shoot their invisible arrows upon you, only as long as the Lord allows. But when their time comes, ye shall be free of all evil." The effect of these words was indescribable. I felt as if a mountain of weight had fallen from me. After 6 weeks of endless darkness, light, at last, light. The telephone rang. It was my mother. "How is our little one doing?" she asked. "Mother, the child's going to get well," I shrieked into the telephone. "Has the fever gone down?" "No, it's still up. It's up at 104, but God has sent me a message," and I told her what I'd read in the Bible. "May God grant it so," said Mother. I had to hang up immediately because the child was crying for me, and I ran to him, and in that very moment the horrible swelling opened up. In the last few days it had become as large as a large ball. It burst internally into his throat and mouth, and a horrible greenish mass of pus came pouring out of his lips I couldn't help remembering the green ball. It was the same color. The doctors had been waiting for the swelling on the outside of the boy's neck to go soft so that they could cut. But on the outside it was still so hard that they did not dare. Now nature had taken a hand herself, freed the child. A few moments later he lay down again and fell into a deep sleep. He slept as if he were dead the whole night long. We kept watch. His pulse became stronger, his breathing slower, and his forehead was no longer wet with perspiration. He was sleeping peacefully. After the long weeks of unending vigil, I lay down myself and tried to go to sleep, but with no success. My nerves had forgotten what sleep was. The child slept soundly until 11 o'clock the next morning. Father telephoned often. "How's the boy? Still sleeping? How's the pulse?" "Yes, Father, the fever's gone and he's sleeping soundly, a healthy sleep." Finally he opened his eyes and asked for milk. Like a dry sponge soaking up liquid, he drank 4 glasses, one after another, and then he asked for his playthings. The next day was Christmas. My husband, my parents, my brothers and sister came by for that afternoon to bring a little Christmas tree and an armload of toys for the boys. I sat him in an armchair and pulled him into the middle of the room so that our family could wave to him through the grill work in the front door of the house. The boy was still thin, beyond recognition, and weak, but alive. We all cried for joy. The evil had been forced to yield. Its time on the great cosmic clock had run out. I was so moved I could not speak. I felt as if I were dreaming. It was the very picture of gratitude. I was the very picture of gratitude. My wish and God's will had been identical in this case. He gave me back my boy. My son recovered slowly. The young doctor bade us farewell, and the day finally came when our youngster could get up. He had learned to walk all over again. He had to learn to walk all over again, but he became stronger day after day, and by the end of 2 months, he was well enough to go back to school. I could sleep once more, and I wanted to return to my sculpturing. I felt so strange, however, just as if I were a little bit tipsy, and the world about me looked as if I were seeing it through water. Everything seemed to get hazier and hazier, farther and farther away from me. The serum with which I had been vaccinated had been prepared from hormones from stallions. As I heard later, the new, scarcely tested preparation affected women as if it were a completely foreign substance, a poison in their blood. The papers were full of the scandal. Most of the women who had been vaccinated showed early symptoms of neuroses. Then, as their bodies tried to get rid of their poisoned blood, they suffered from incessant hemorrhages. There was no way to help them, and many died. As a consequence, there were masses of lawsuits. I felt worse and worse from day to day. Things around me looked more and more as though I were seeing them through water. A strange feeling overcame me, and I didn't know myself anymore. I was able to walk straight, but I always felt dizzy. This odd feeling that I was looking at the world through some strange liquid grew stronger from day to day. One day, I had an attack. Instead of a regular pulse beat, there was only a flutter. Unable to walk, eat, or speak, I lay in bed with an ice pack over my heart, still seeing the world as if it were swimming around me. It would take us too far afield if I were to describe how I suffered. Suffice to say, I wandered through the various departments of hell for months. By summertime, I was somewhat recovered, and on our doctor's advice, we all went to the lake. Perhaps the change of air was good for me. I lay on the terrace of our family villa trying to calm and control my dancing nerves. Hundreds and thousands of times I repeated the word, calm, calm, calm. Slowly, my condition improved, and sometimes I was even able to sleep at night. One day, I noticed my son was not playing with the other children on the beach. On the contrary, he was hanging around my sofa and being suspiciously quiet about it. When with a sudden shock, I began to hope he was not falling ill again. I do not like it when children are suspiciously quiet. "What's the matter with you?" I asked him. "Why aren't you playing with the other children?" The boy leaned against the back of the sofa, looked at me attentively, and answered, "Mummy, is it possible that I've lived before?" His question amazed me. "Where did you get that idea?" I asked in return. "I was in the garden and I saw a big black beetle, and I poked him a bit with a twig, and he turned over on his back and he lay still as if he were dead." Excuse me. I was curious to see what he would do, so I watched him and I waited and I kept on watching him for a long time. Perhaps it was even half an hour, and then all of a sudden the beetle righted himself and ran away. It was then that I had a very strong feeling that I had lived before. It only seemed as if I had died and people thought I was dead. But then I got up and went on, just like the beetle, and here I am now, alive again. That means I never died at all. And I'm asking you for another reason, Mummy. Every day when I wake up in the morning, before I open my eyes, I always have a feeling that if I had to jump up and go hunting and find food for my wife and my children, and only when I open my eyes and I look around the room, I realize I'm a little boy. I'm your son. But, Mummy, my wife and my children and everybody there are not like the people here, but they're all black and quite naked." An embarrassed smile spread across my son's face. I listened to him with ever-growing interest, but I did not want him to notice my surprise. I let him finish talking, and then I asked, "So, you were the father of several children, but where did you live?" The child took paper and pencil, and with a sure and steady hand he drew a round hut with a very special opening in the roof for the smoke. He could never have seen a hut like that in our country. Before the hut he sketched a naked woman with long hanging breasts. Beside the hut there was the body of water with waves, and in the distance palm trees. "We lived in huts like this," he said, showing me the drawing. "We built them ourselves, just as each of us built for himself a boat by hollowing out a log. There was a big river there, but we couldn't go in deep, as we do here in the lake, because some kind of monster was living in that water. Don't remember what kind, only that it bit off people's legs, and that's why we didn't go into the water. Now you can understand why I always screamed and howled last year when you tried to take me into the water. I was afraid that something under the water was going to bite off my legs. Even now, whenever I go bathing, I have that same feeling. Only I know now that there's nothing dangerous in the water here. And remember last year when I wanted to row, Mummy? It was just after we bought the big family boat. At first you wouldn't let me because you said I would have to learn how. But I just knew I could remember, because I remembered how well I could get around in my dugout canoe, as well as if there were a part of me, while still sitting in it, I could even flip over in the water and come up again on the other side. Remember I kept begging for so long that you finally got impatient and you said I could try, but I would see how I could not row, remember? And remember how surprised you were when I did row? And with only one oar, I was too small to handle both oars. My arms were too short, but I was able to move our big boat around safely, among the other boats and all the bathers. Oh boy, with my dugout canoe there where I was living, I could do anything. You should have seen me then, and the trees were not like the trees here. And with his stubby finger, he pointed to the drawing. They were like this one. There were all kinds of other plants there. See? That's me hunting for a big bird, and that's my hat beside me. Everything he drew made a perfect tropical landscape with palm trees and other tropical plants. The figure supposedly represented him as a typical Negro. Only his hat was suspicious. It looked exactly like a modern man's felt hat. Not wanting either to disturb him or to excite his imagination, I questioned him very cautiously. He had never seen naked women, except perhaps as works of art, and these latter never had hanging breasts. So I asked him, "Why have you drawn your wife with such long, ugly hanging breasts?" The child looked at me in amazement at such a question, then answered without hesitation and very matter-of-factly, "Because she had breasts like that, and they're not ugly. She was very beautiful," he added proudly. This reply convinced me that my boy had not heard these things in some way or another from others. He had never been to a cinema, and he had never had any books about Africa. Where could he have picked up the idea that a woman with long hanging breasts is beautiful? Our ideal of beauty is quite different. I finally asked him, "What is the last thing you remember?" "I was hunting when a tiger approached. I threw my spear, but that didn't stop it. With my spear in his breast, he jumped on me. I don't know what happened after that." Good. That's all very interesting. Naturally, it's possible that you've lived before and all that really happened, but now you're here. Don't think about the past anymore. Think about the present. You can tell me all about things like this, but don't tell other people about your memories. "Yes, Mummy," said the boy. "I already know that because grown-ups think we kids are crazy. They always make fun of us. But what do you think happened to my wife and children?" "I cannot tell you that, but don't forget that everything passes away. Only love remains eternal, and so love will lead you to them again in this life." "Oh, that's fine," said the boy, and he ran off to resume his playing with the other children. I took his drawings and put them into my diary I had been keeping since I was born. I never asked the boy any more about these memories. I did not want his imagination to be stimulated, nor did I want him to lose himself in these memories. Why should I? I knew that he had not been able to see or read any books about Africa. I knew every step he took and what he was doing, and it really was surprising to recall that although he was generally quite brave and even inclined to be a bit of a daredevil, when we had first taken him out to bathe in the lake, he had fought and kicked and struggled almost savagely, screaming at the top of his lungs as if we were trying to kill him. I had had to explain to him that he could come along with the rest of us without fear, that nothing was going to happen to him, and it was only then that he let me carry him into the water. But I had to promise to watch out for him and not leave him alone. The next day, the very same thing happened. He refused to go into the water alone, kicking and screaming as he'd done the day before, and again I had to carry him in my arms. Little by little, he conquered his fear, and he finally became a little duck, happily splashing, rowing, sailing on the lake all day long. Our conversation made me remember how, when he was very small, around 4 or 5, he and his little cousin would paint pictures together, while the faces his little cousin painted were always pink. His were always dark brown. When I once tried to show him why he should not paint faces so dark, he made no reply, but he merely went on painting chocolate-colored faces. We spoke no more about his memories. Now and again he made some comment, which showed me that these things were still quite alive in him. Several years later, when he was about 13, one of my neighbors came running into the garden, calling me to come out into the street. My son, he said, had climbed up to the top of a very high poplar tree, so high he would certainly not be able to come down without falling. There were a number of trees, all of them about 60 to 70 feet high. I peered upward into the branches to try to see which tree my boy was in. Finally, I yelled up to find out where he was, and he promptly yelled back to ask what I wanted. "Come down immediately." "Why?" "We're not discussing why now," I called back. "You come down here right now." Without saying a word, he started to descend, climbing skillfully but cautiously, with complete assurance, like a little monkey. Finally, he jumped down from the lowest branch, and with controlled annoyance, he asked, "Why did I have to come down?" "Because it's absolutely senseless for you to climb up so high. It's positively shameful when other people have to tell me what you're doing. What's the good of a daredevil stunt? What in the world were you doing up there? I've made myself a test where I can eat a meal of boiled corn. It tastes much better there, and I get such wonderful view. I can look out over everything." "Well, don't do it anymore. What sense can there possibly be in doing anything so dangerous? Build yourself a nest down here." The boy looked away for a moment angrily, and then he said, "Okay, I'm not supposed to climb up there anymore because you think it's dangerous. But who do you think looked after me when I was living in the jungle and climbed around the trees, which were a lot higher, so that I could watch the animals? Where were you then?" "I don't know where I was then, but now I'm here, and you have to obey," I answered emphatically. He wasn't pleased at all, but I gave him plenty of freedom in other respects. He soon found other occupations, and the matter was forgotten. Some years later, he came home from school in complete exaggeration. "Ridiculous," he exploded. "The priest was trying to make us believe that people live only once. But I know that people live more than once. I know it. But it's best not to try to talk to grown-ups. A fellow just has to keep his mouth shut." The impressions of this life had probably displaced the memories in his consciousness for a long time. And for a long time he made no further mention of these matters. When he was about 15, he asked us to buy him a big jazz drum. Together we went to the best music shop in town and picked out the biggest drum in sight with all its trappings. Then the miraculous experience we had when we first tried to row was repeated again. As soon as he had the drum in the house, he took the 2 drumsticks and he sat down beside it, and he started playing the most difficult rhythms and the most impossible syncopations, all with the perfect sure hand and complete self-confidence. He played ecstatically, his eyes beaming, tears rolling down his cheeks. He said nothing about how he became able to play a drum. Only once, as he was playing a very peculiar rhythm, he remarked, "Hear that, Mum? That's how we used to signal each other and pass on messages across tremendous distances." And then he went on drumming like one possessed. He was never interested in reading stories about Negro life. "Why should I?" he asked. "I know better than books can tell me what life was like then. Why should I care what white people have written about them? And when I read real descriptions, I always start to cry, even when I try not to." Even as a grown-up young officer in the Air Force, seeing a Negro cinema film always moved him to tears. Sitting there in the darkness, he would cry like a baby, although silently, with big salty tears streaming down his cheeks. Where had he learned to play the drums? How hard it is. I learned myself when I once tried it. How does a city child, want to own a drum? And why should a happy, up-to-date young man burst into tears when he plays a drum or sees Negro films? Years later, Paul Brunton paid us a visit when he was returning to Europe from India. I told him about my son's memories, and he asked to see the drawings. After examining them quite attentively, he said, "This kind of hut is typical of a particular tribe living on the banks of the Zambezi in Central Africa. He has drawn it correctly in every detail." "Yes, but this hat isn't an African hat. It looks like a civilized man's hat, made of felt." Brunton smiled. "No, you're mistaken. The child is right. The hat is indeed typical of this tribe. Only it's not made of felt, it's made of bulrushes, plaited together. His hunting weapon is correctly drawn too. And the monster that bites off people's legs is a crocodile. Of course, there are many of them there. But tell me how you came to attract a Negro as your child, he finally asked. I don't know how to answer that one, I replied. And then we both smiled and talked about other things. This all happened several years later. My son's first memories came that summer at the lake shore when the little black beetle attracted his attention and he stopped playing to watch it for a long, long time. Without knowing it, he used an Indian method to achieve great concentration. Indian yogis do it by staring for a long time at a black spot on the wall or at a crystal ball. Unknowingly, the child did the same, for the black beetle was like a black spot, and the boy probably fell into trance quite unintentionally. Thus, the memory of a previous incarnation came to life within him. The summer went by, and my condition improved. My consciousness was clear again, and I no longer saw the world in such a hazy fashion. The burning sensation in my blood also stopped. But in the autumn, after our return to the city, I began to have the same symptoms as many people who had died from their horse serum vaccinations. I had to go back to bed again, suffering from terrible cramps and pains. I never would have believed that a human being can endure such torture without dying. I completely lost control of my body, just as my nerves had been quite paralyzed. When I wanted to raise my hand did not budge. It was a terrifying condition, and in my sleepless nights, I heard an ugly, repugnant voice, drowning out all the roaring in my ears. So, you think you can catch me? The doctors consulted each other again and advised an operation. That same evening we had a telephone call from one of my husband's boyhood friends with whom we had kept in close touch. He had just returned from a sojourn of many years in India. The next day he came by to pay us a visit. Seeing me in such terrible shape, he said, while I was in India, I spent a lot of time learning yoga under a great master. If you follow my advice and do as I say, you will get well again. Under no circumstances should you submit to an operation. I promised to do whatever he told me. He then showed me a few simple breathing exercises, which I could do as I lay there in bed, only half alive. He told me I should practice them often during the day, and in doing them I was to guide and control my consciousness, follow his instructions to the letter. Within a few days, my condition was considerably better. The pains were abating, and my other symptoms showed surprising change for the better. Within 2 weeks, I was so much improved that I could even stand up for a few minutes at a time. I became myself again. I felt minor disturbances, but our friend showed me some more yoga exercises, and I kept improving. By the time spring came around, I was strong enough to travel to the seashore to spend a few months convalescing. That blessed climate, combined with the saltwater bathing and yoga exercises, gave me back my health. During my last 4 weeks there, my husband was with me, and I experienced the most beautiful period of my personal life. Only one who has been hopelessly sick and then recovered knows what it means to be well again. Oh, thou unknown strength and power, people call, and power. Let me start that again. O thou unknown strength and power, people call God, I thank thee that thou hast given me back my health, that thou hast permitted me to escape from hell, that thou hast enabled me to avoid becoming a burden upon my loved ones, enabled me to become a useful, working human being again. The sun had never been so beautiful, nor the sky so blue, nor the sea so sparkling as that summer. When autumn came, we went home, and soon I was back at work in my studio. One evening we all went to the cinema together. The program consisted of a number of Walt Disney films. We got an immense amount of fun out of watching Mickey Mouse, Pluto, Donald Duck, and then came a film in which all three of these animals teamed up and founded a firm to drive the ghosts and spooks out of haunted houses. They advertised their service in the newspaper, and their advertisement came to the attention of one of a number of ghosts who were living together in an old castle. He straightway summoned all the other ghosts and spooks and goblins and indignantly read the notice to them. Incensed by the idea that even ghosts would no longer be able to live in peace, they all consulted together and decided they would teach the people in this new firm a lesson. One of them called up the firm and asked to have a man sent over. Then the head ghost assigned a specific task to each of the many spooks assembled. One was to hide behind the door, another under the bed, another inside the mirror, so that anyone looking at it would see a ghost instead of himself, all with the idea of giving the people in Mickey and Co. such a terrible scare that they would be glad to give up their plan. When the jobs were all assigned, the chief spook gave a signal to all his cronies, and they disappeared by simply rolling up into a greenish phosphorescent ball, which rolled away, gliding and hopping and disappearing in different directions, laughing fiendishly at the idea that earthly creatures should think of trying to catch them. I became stiff with amazement. My younger sister and brother began to call out, "Look, look, Esther's green ball, just look at that." They were so excited and so loud in their comments, I thought for a little while that the ushers were going to throw us out of the house. They could not have known, no one could have, that the entire scene, as the chief spook himself rolled himself up into a greenish ball, laughed fiendishly, and hopped away, was exactly the way I had seen it, long, long before. I was thoroughly shaken. Could it really be that other people saw these manifestations too? I did not doubt for a moment that Walt Disney had actually seen such a greenish ball, or how could he have come to invent, out of pure imagination, a sequence matching with exquisite precision exactly what I had seen long, long before. It was absolutely too much to suppose that this was pure coincidence. But that was not all. A few weeks later, I received a book entitled Aram, Magic, and Mysticism. It was a large collection of authentic documents. After reading about a number of phenomena, I came upon the following quotation. "How should this somebody come through a door that was locked and bolted, knowing full well that the door was firmly locked? I thought, nobody can get in here, even if the doorknob is turned and the door made a noise. But what was that? There was a rustling sound in the room, a rapping sound in the wardrobe. It came over my bed, and it made its presence known by rapping on my bedstead, then went past my bed and tinkled on the glass of the lamp on my right table. And a bit further on, I saw nothing. I did not particularly try to see anything. Only the person in the next room claims to have seen on the floor of my room a light about the size of a full moon. He claims to have seen clearly how this rolling ball of light appeared in the doorway and disappeared behind the wall." I could scarcely believe my eyes. Was I meeting this full moonlight ball of light again? Apparently, this ball of light is not such a rare thing. How strange. With a little reflection, I can find an analogous example in electricity, the ball of lightning. This ball also seems to roll through the air. There are reports recording how such balls of lightning have bounced into a room, through a window, rolled across the room, and out the other open window without doing any damage. As long as the lightning stays rolled up in a ball, there is no danger, but when it emerges from this spherical form, it destroys everything in its path. In this latter case, a ball of lightning is 1,000 times more dangerous than any ordinary lightning. What then is this greenish phosphorescent ball, which can do such catastrophic damage, if not a ball of lightning, only on another plane? Handed down to us from incredibly ancient times, there is this saying attributed to an outstanding great initiate, Hermes Trismegistos, Trismegistos, Hermes Trismegistus, who is said to know all the secrets of heaven and earth, as above, so below, as below, so above. What a remarkable parallel phenomena, this green ball and the ball of lightning.